9 women were sentenced to hang at dawn. By morning their cell was empty. No broken chains, no forced door, no footprints in the mud, and the only man who stayed awake that entire night swore before God that he heard nothing. Nothing at all, but he was lying. He had been lying for 25 years, and what he finally confessed on his deathbed will make you question everything you thought you knew about Salem. On the morning of June 29, 1692, the iron, barred cell inside the Salem jail that had housed 9 condemned women was discovered completely vacant. The heavy oak door remained bolted from the outside. The single window was far too narrow for any woman to squeeze through. And the jailer, a man called Corwin, swore before God and every magistrate present that his eyes had not closed once through the entire night. Those 9 women had been scheduled to meet the gallows at first light. When Reverend Nicholas Noyes arrived to deliver their final prayers, he found nothing inside that cell but 9 wooden spoons arranged in a flawless row across the stone floor. Beside them lay a small pile of what a constable would later describe in a letter that vanished from the court record within 2 weeks as freshly cut hair, still damp, still warm against a trembling hand. What truly occurred inside that cell between midnight and 5 in the morning has never been formally acknowledged by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The names of those 9 women were struck from the execution roster so completely that most historians today believe they were never charged at all. But deep in the basement of the Essex County Archive, inside a sealed box marked only with a date and a single word, incident, documents survive that tell an entirely different story. A story built on land, on money, on 3 men gathered in a cellar at midnight, and on a bargain struck by 9 desperate women that would bind their descendants to silence for more than 300 years. But before we go deeper into the story of Salem's 9 women, if dark American mysteries told with the detail they deserve are what keep you up at night, take a moment right now to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit the notification bell, and drop a comment telling me which state or country you're listening from tonight. Now, to truly understand what happened inside that cell, we need to travel back to the spring of that same year, to a village already eating itself alive from within. Salem Village in 1692 bore no resemblance to the Salem that modern visitors imagine. It was no quaint town of cobblestones and wooden houses. It was a windswept, impoverished farming parish of roughly 550 souls, situated inland from the far wealthier port of Salem town, with which it had been locked in a grinding legal and religious conflict for nearly 2 decades. The village demanded independence. The town refused. The village wanted its own meeting house, its own minister, its own authority to levy taxes. The town ruled that Salem Village was a subordinate parish and would remain so. Out of that long, slow resentment grew 2 opposing factions. On one side stood the Putnam family and their allies, farmers of the western uplands whose fortunes had been quietly eroding for a generation, while Atlantic trade made the eastern merchants wealthy. On the other stood the Porter family and their allies, connected through marriage and commerce to Salem town, to the shipping lanes, to the new economy rising out of Boston and Marblehead. For nearly 20 years, those 2 factions had clashed over every pew arrangement, every tax demand, every ministerial appointment, every disputed inch of boundary land. By the winter of 1691, that hatred had become the single defining fact of life in the village. Children learned which path across the common ground was safe, and which led past a house whose name their father had told them never to speak aloud. Women learned not to take a seat beside certain other women at meeting, because a generation of accumulated grievance sat invisibly between them on the bench. Men learned to carry a club when they walked the roads after dark, and not because of wolves or bears, though those creatures still haunted the edges of the village in those years, but because of their neighbors. It was that same winter, inside the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, that 2 young girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, began displaying what the village physician William Griggs could only bring himself to describe as the hand of the evil one. They convulsed on the kitchen floor. They spoke in voices that were not their own. Deep voices, scraping voices, flat voices that seemed to emerge from somewhere behind their teeth, rather than from within their throats. They complained of being pinched, pricked, and bitten by hands no one else could see. Small red welts appeared on their arms and legs, with no one able to account for how they had been made. When pressed to name the ones tormenting them, the girls named 3 women, all outsiders, all without male protectors in the village. A woman from Barbados named Tituba, held as property within the parsonage itself. A beggar woman called Sarah Good, known for her foul mouth and her habit of smoking a pipe on her neighbors' doorsteps. And a half-recluse named Sarah Osborne, who had taken a husband considerably younger than herself following the death of her first, and who had been the subject of village gossip for a decade. Within weeks, the circle of accusers had swelled beyond those 2 girls to a company of 7, then 12, then more. Within months it had swallowed all of Essex County whole. Respectable farm wives stood up inside the meeting house and fell to the floor, screaming that the specter of a neighbor was tormenting them from across the room. Children of 11 and 12 testified under oath to things they could not possibly have witnessed. And the magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, dispatched from Salem town to investigate, made a decision in the first week of March that would seal the fate of everything that followed. They decided the girls were telling the truth. And they decided that spectral evidence, the visions the accusers described of their tormentors visiting them in invisible form, would be accepted in the preliminary examinations. It was a decision that had no foundation in English common law. It was a decision that would, within 6 months, place 150 people in chains. And it was a decision that certain men within the Putnam family almost immediately understood could be steered. By the time the Special Court of Oyer and Terminer was convened in June of 1692, under the newly arrived royal governor Sir William Phipps, the jails of Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and Cambridge were overflowing with the accused. The Salem jail itself had never been built for such a purpose. It was a converted house on Prison Lane, a 2-story structure of rough, cut timber and fieldstone, with a cellar that had been crudely reinforced with iron bars and a single oak door. The air in that cellar was said to be so foul during the summer months that the jailer's wife refused to carry food to the prisoners herself and sent instead a 14-year-old serving girl who pressed a vinegar-soaked cloth across her face each time she descended the steep wooden steps. The cellar walls wept with moisture even in dry weather. The floor was packed earth for the first 3 feet and then stone, and the seam between the 2 was a breeding ground for rats that no amount of poison or terrier work could eliminate. Prisoners reported being bitten in their sleep. Several of the older women developed wounds that refused to heal. The smell, according to a letter written that June by a visiting minister from Ipswich, was unlike anything he had encountered in all his life. A compound of human waste and rotting straw and standing water, and something else. Something sweeter, something more intimate, which he could not name, and which he wrote he hoped never to encounter again. The women confined there in June of 1692 were chained by the ankle, not to one another, but to iron rings driven directly into the stone walls. This was not standard procedure. It had been ordered in explicit written instructions from Magistrate John Hathorne, who believed and stated openly in his correspondence with Cotton Mather in Boston that witches could travel in spectral form through solid walls if left unchained, and could afflict the godly even from within their place of confinement. Hathorne further ordered that every prisoner be searched upon arrival for what were called witch marks, meaning any unusual spot or protrusion on the body that might be used to nurse a familiar spirit. These searches were carried out by a group of respectable village matrons, and their reports, preserved in the Essex County Court files, make for some of the most disturbing reading to survive from that entire season. Women in their 50s and 60s were stripped naked and examined in every fold and crease of their bodies by women who had known them for 30 years. Women who had stood beside them at weddings, women who had helped them bury their children. The searches lasted on average 2 hours. Afterward, the prisoners were returned to the cellar without their undergarments, which were kept as evidence. They sat on the stone floor in torn shifts, some weeping, some praying, and some staring at the low ceiling in a silence that their fellow prisoners found more frightening than any tears could be. The 9 women in the cell on the night of June 28th were not, for the most part, the women whose names we remember today. They were not Bridget Bishop, who had already hanged on the 10th of June, the first of the condemned to die on Gallows Hill. They were not Rebecca Nurse or Sarah Good or Elizabeth Howe or Susanna Martin or Sarah Wilds, who would swing together in a mass execution on the morning of July 19th, their bodies left hanging from the oaks on Gallows Hill for most of the day before being cut down and thrown into the shallow crevice in the rock that has ever since been called the Witch's Hole. The 9 women in that cell on the night of June 28th were, according to the surviving jail ledger, Mary Osgood of Andover, aged 55, the wife of Captain John Osgood, a man of considerable standing in the militia; Hannah Carrier of Andover, aged 38, whose mother Martha Carrier would hang on August 19th and whose own name would later be quietly struck from the records; Abigail Faulkner, a minister's daughter, aged 33 and visibly pregnant; Martha Emerson of Haverhill, aged 29; Sarah Cloyce of Salem Village, aged 51, sister of Rebecca Nurse, whose composure in court had been remarked upon and feared in equal measure; Mary Toothaker of Billerica, aged 40; Rebecca Eames of Boxford, aged 48; Deliverance Hobbs, listed in the ledger as about 40 but in truth closer to 35, a woman who had initially confessed to witchcraft and then recanted, making her the most despised among the accused who had not confessed; and a 9th name that has been so thoroughly scratched from the ledger that the parchment beneath is worn completely through, as though someone had taken a knife to it in a state of tremendous agitation, leaving behind only a pale oval where a name had once been recorded in a clear secretary's hand. What bound these 9 women together was not, as one might at first suppose, poverty or social marginality. On the contrary, every one of them, with the possible exception of the 9th, was the wife or daughter of a landholder of considerable standing in the northern part of Essex County. Every one of them came from a family holding contested title to property along the disputed boundary between Salem Village and the town of Andover, a boundary that had been the subject of 3 separate surveys since the 1660s, none of which had been fully agreed upon by both parties. And every one of them had, in the weeks immediately preceding her arrest, either refused to sell her land to a Putnam agent, or filed a formal petition of protest with the Essex County Court against the most recent survey, or done both. This pattern was not noticed at the time; it would not be noticed for another century and a half. And when it was finally noticed, the man who noticed it would not live long enough to see his observation published. The event that would come to be known, in the few private letters that survived, simply as the incident, took place on the night of June 28th, 1692, a Tuesday. Heavy rain had rolled in off the Atlantic that afternoon, and the roads leading into Salem Village were deep in mud by the time the sun went down. The sun set that evening at roughly 8:30. By 9 o'clock, the last lamps in the village windows had gone dark. The last dogs had been called in from the yards. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet grass and the ocean 3 miles to the east, and the frogs in the marshes along the river were loud enough that a man on the post road could hear them from a quarter of a mile away. The jailer that summer was George Corwin, a cousin of the magistrate, appointed to the position that spring following the sudden death of his predecessor, a man named Bridget, who had died officially of fever, but whose passing had, according to village gossip, been considerably more complicated. Corwin was 36, a man of modest intelligence and considerable ambition, married but childless. On that particular night he was accompanied by 2 constables, Joseph Herrick, 45 years old, pious, the father of 7, and John Putnam the younger, aged 24, a nephew of Thomas Putnam, The three men had been drinking cider from a large stone, where jug delivered to the jail that afternoon by a serving boy from the tavern at the sign of the King's Head in Salem town. The jug was later found on its side in the jailer's room, most of its contents soaked into the floorboards, the wood beneath stained dark in a shape roughly resembling a hand. Neither the serving boy nor the tavern keeper could afterward recall who had ordered the jug, how it had come to be delivered, or who had paid for it. The ledger records from the King's Head for that month had been lost in what the tavern keeper described as a small fire in his ledger room. A fire that had destroyed only the month of June, had not spread further, and which the tavern keeper himself had not witnessed, having been out of town at the time. At approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, according to Herrick's later deposition, the cider began producing effects unlike any cider the three men had drunk before. This was not the effect of ordinary drunkenness. Corwin described a heaviness in his limbs, a humming in his ears, and an overwhelming compulsion to lie down on the earthen floor. His hands felt wrapped in wet wool. His tongue felt too large for his mouth. When he tried to speak to Herrick, his words came out slow and thick, as if he were speaking from somewhere beneath deep water, and Herrick had to lean close to make any sense of them. Putnam the younger became sick, vomited twice in the back garden behind the jail, then sat down on the doorstep and wept for reasons he was afterward entirely unable to explain. He would say later that he had been thinking of his mother, who had died when he was 9, and that for the space of perhaps an hour he had been unable to recall her face, and that this had filled him with a grief so sharp he could not bear to remain inside the building. Herrick, by his own account, stayed conscious longer than the other two, though he too felt the heaviness and the humming. He sat upright in his wooden chair against the wall of the jailer's room, clutching a Bible that had belonged to his father, and he began to recite under his breath the 23rd Psalm, which he had memorized as a boy of 7. He recited it perhaps 20 times, and it was he who heard, at some point between midnight and 1 in the morning, what he described as the sound of women weeping. A quiet, continuous weeping that did not rise and fall as natural weeping does, but held a single low note, like a bow drawn slowly across a viol. The sound came from directly below him, from the cellar, and then, more disturbing than the weeping, came the sound of women laughing. Not loud laughter, not hysterical laughter, but quiet, companionable laughter, the kind that follows a small remark made between friends who have known each other a long time, the sort of laughter that belongs in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary afternoon, and then nothing. Silence. The silence, Herrick said, was worse than either the weeping or the laughter had been. He did not, he swore afterward, go down into the cellar. He did not hear the oak door open. He did not hear the bolt slide back. He did not hear footsteps on the cellar stairs. And this, as he would finally confess on his deathbed, was the first lie of his later life. When the three men came fully back to themselves at approximately 4:30 in the morning, the first gray light beginning to appear in the eastern sky above the rooftops, and the first birds calling in the elms surrounding the jail, Corwin rose stiffly from the floor where he had at some point laid himself down, took the keys from the peg in the jailer's room, and descended the narrow stairs to the cellar to rouse the prisoners for the walk to Gallows Hill. He unlocked the heavy oak door of the cell. He found what I have already described. The ankle chains had not been broken. They had been unlocked and laid in neat coils on the stone floor beside the wall rings. The keys to those ankle chains hung exactly where they always hung, on a peg in the jailer's room 2 floors above, behind a door that had been bolted from the inside. The 9 wooden spoons lay in a perfect row in the center of the floor, handles all pointing toward the door, evenly spaced. The small pile of hair lay beside them, nothing else, no bodies, no torn clothing, no marks on the walls, no mud on the floor to suggest the women had been dragged out through any passage. The single high window, too narrow for even a small child, remained shuttered and barred. Corwin sat down on the stone floor and did not speak for nearly an hour. When he finally rose, he went upstairs and told Herrick and Putnam what he had found, and the 3 of them stood together in the jailer's room in silence for a long while before any of them dared speak. It was Herrick who spoke first, and what he said, according to Corwin's later private statement, was this: We must agree now on what we saw before anyone else is told. In the decades that followed, Salem village tore itself to pieces over what had happened in 1692. The 9 women of the incident were absorbed into the larger horror of those months so completely that their names were rarely spoken aloud except within their own families, and not often even then. The parish records show that by 1697, 5 of the 9 families had relocated, 3 to Connecticut, 1 to the province of New York, 1 to a settlement in what is now southern Maine. The 6th family, the Osgoods, remained in Andover but ceased attending any organized church until the 1730s, and when they at last returned to church attendance, it was to a different denomination, in a different town, under a minister who knew nothing of the family's history. The 7th family, the Cloys, continued filing petitions with the General Court for restoration of their property rights until 1699, at which point Peter Cloy, Sarah's husband, died suddenly of what his physician described, in a phrase that would appear several more times in this story, as a softening of the brain. After his death, no further petitions were filed. The 8th and 9th families cannot be traced at all, which is in itself remarkable, because the Essex County records of that period are otherwise quite thorough. These families had been in Massachusetts since the 1630s and had left abundant documentary traces before the summer of 1692. After it, they left none. It is as if they had been erased, not forgotten, actively erased. Their names removed from tax rolls, church rolls, militia lists, deed records, leaving behind only the negative space of families that ought to have existed where no family now was. What did survive is a series of letters exchanged between Reverend Increase Mather in Boston and a Salem town merchant named Philip English. English had himself been accused of witchcraft in April of 1692, had escaped from the Boston jail through the intervention of friends and the payment of certain sums to certain jailers, and had fled to New York. From there, in October of that year, he wrote to Mather with a single, carefully worded question. He asked whether Mather had any knowledge of a land transaction that had taken place in the final week of June 1692, involving 9 disputed parcels along the border of Salem Village and Andover, and whether the signatures on those deeds of sale bore any resemblance to the marks the accused had made on the examination documents before the magistrates. Mather's reply, if he wrote one, has not survived. English's original letter has, preserved among his family's papers in New York, and it is specific in a way Mather could not have missed. English did not ask whether the accused had sold their land. He asked whether their marks on the deeds matched their marks on the accusations. This is a strange question to ask unless one already had some suspicion about the condition of those women at the moment the deeds were signed. 3 months after English wrote that letter, in January of 1693, 9 parcels of land along that exact boundary were transferred to new ownership. The new owners were in every case men connected by marriage or business to Thomas Putnam, the single most active accuser in the Salem proceedings, a man whose handwriting appears on more of complaint documents than any other individual's. The original owners on those deeds, the 9 women of the incident, had signed with crosses rather than with their own names, which is notable because several of them, including Mary Osgood and Abigail Faulkner, were demonstrably literate and had signed other documents in their own hands earlier that same year. Mary Osgood, for instance, had signed her name in a clear and careful hand on a parish subscription list for the relief of the poor in March of 1692. The Mary Osgood of the January 1693 deed signed only with a cross. And those crosses, when compared by a suspicious clerk in the Essex Deeds Office some 20 years later, matched in precise detail the crosses the same women had made on the accusation document that had sent them to the cellar in the first place, not approximately, precisely, down to the angle of intersection and the slight hook at the end of the lower stroke. The clerk who made that observation, a man named Ebenezer Boddick, died of a fall down the stairs of his own home within a week of making his report. His notes, drafted but not yet formally submitted, were never entered into the record. His widow, questioned afterward by a neighbor who had been a close friend of her husband, said only that in the days before his death he had been unable to sleep and had walked the rooms of the house from midnight until dawn, murmuring about crosses and signatures and a cellar he had never himself seen. The widow did not remarry. She moved some months after the funeral to her sister's home in Newbury. According to neighbors who helped her pack, she took with her only the clothes on her back and a small wooden box that she would not allow anyone else to touch. If this story is unsettling you the way it unsettled me, take a moment now to hit the like button and tell me in the comments which part of this has troubled you most. Every comment helps more people find these forgotten histories, and every reaction tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be seen. The quiet, unofficial investigation into what had truly happened on the night of June 28th began in 1710, when the General Court of Massachusetts passed an act reversing the attainders of many of those convicted in the Salem proceedings and granting financial restitution to their families. The families of the 9 women of the incident did not apply. This too was noted. A former magistrate of the original court of Oyer and Terminer named Samuel Sewall, the same man who in 1700 had stood in silence in the Old South Meeting House in Boston while his pastor read aloud his public repentance for his role in the trials, wrote in his personal diary that he had made inquiries and been unable to locate a single living relative of any of the 9. This was on its face impossible. The Osgood family alone had at least 14 documented descendants living in Essex County in 1710. The Cloys had direct relations in Salem village itself. But when Sewall traveled to Andover in the autumn of 1711 and presented himself at the Osgood homestead, he was received by a man who claimed the name of Osgood but refused to discuss the matter of Mary Osgood, his own mother, and asked Sewall to leave the property before the sun set behind the hill to the west. In his diary, Sewall wrote that this man's eyes held a quality he had seen only once before, in the eyes of a man who had survived the Deerfield massacre of 1704 and had watched his own 3 children killed before him. It was the look, Sewall wrote, of someone who had entered into a bargain he could not undo and who was compelled each day to live beneath its weight, knowing that if he ever once broke its terms, something he loved would be taken from him. Sewall continued his inquiries over the following 2 years. He was a careful man, a man whose public repentance had been sincere and costly, and he could not rest knowing there might be some further wrong within the Salem matter that he had never been told about and might have unknowingly helped to make possible. Through a contact in the Connecticut General Assembly, he learned that the families who had relocated to Connecticut had done so under new surnames and had purchased their new lands with sums of money that would have been impossible for them to have saved from the farms they had left behind. The Osgoods had held a farm worth perhaps £60 at the time of Mary Osgood's arrest. The family that arrived in East Hartford that autumn under a different name paid £215 in silver for a property there. The Faulkners had held even less. The family that arrived in Middletown paid nearly $300. Through a correspondent in New York, he found that the family that had gone south had also taken a new name and arrived in Manhattan with enough capital to open a small import business that by 1715 had grown into a large one, entangled through credit and shared ventures with several of the leading merchant houses of the city, including interests connected to the Putnam network in Boston and 2 members of the Royal Governor's Council, whose initials Sewall recorded in the margins of his notebook, but whose names he declined to write out in full. And at last, through an old and frightened woman in Salem village, who had once worked as a serving girl in the Putnam household, and was now in her final illness and had sent for a minister to ease her conscience, Sewall learned that on the morning of June 29, 1692, A covered cart had left the Putnam farm at approximately 5 o'clock, heading west on the post road. The cart had been driven by Thomas Putnam himself, accompanied by two riders whose faces the woman could not make out clearly in the dawn light, and whose features she had been warned on that same morning not to try to remember. The cart had been loaded with 9 bundles of what appeared in the gray dawn to be folded laundry. But the bundles, she said, had breathed. She had watched from the kitchen window as the cart passed on the far side of the rail fence. She had seen the canvas rising and falling, 9 separate rhythms, not quite in time with one another. She had turned away and set to kneading her bread, and had not spoken of it to anyone, not even to her husband, for 39 years. She had held it, she told Sewell, inside herself for so long, that when she finally released the words aloud, she could not be entirely certain whether she was remembering the thing itself or remembering the countless thousands of times she had turned it over in her mind. But the bundles had breathed. "I saw it with my own eyes," she said. "God forgive me." Sewell noted at the end of his account of that interview that the woman died 2 nights later in her own bed of what her attending physician called a stoppage of the heart. The minister who had brought her to Sewell's attention died 3 weeks afterward from a fall off his horse on a stretch of road he had ridden without incident every week for 20 years. Sewell never published his findings. The implications were too dangerous for the fragile peace that had been restored to Essex County. The men who would have been implicated, though several were by then dead, had powerful descendants still seated in the general court, in the pulpit, in the magistracy, and in the counting houses of Boston. He confined his investigation to a bound notebook of good calf leather, which he placed at some point in the 1720s inside a locked drawer in his personal library in Boston, instructing his son that the contents were not to be read by any living person, and that if the house should ever leave the family, the drawer was to be emptied and its contents burned unopened. The second, Samuel Sewell, kept that promise. The third did as well. The notebook would not be opened again until 1843, when a great-grandson named Jonathan Sewell Rogers, a young divinity student at Harvard, broke the lock while searching for a particular sermon he had been told was kept among his ancestors' papers. What he found instead was the notebook, and tucked between 2 pages dealing with the incident, a single folded sheet of parchment in a hand that was not Sewell's. It was an affidavit, signed by the Constable Joseph Herrick in the year 1717, the year of his death. Herrick had dictated it to a reverend in Wenham named Joseph Jerish, having found himself unable to die without confessing what he had seen on the night of June 28, 1692. He had come to the reverend on a Tuesday morning in February of 1717. He was 70 years old by then, his body thin and shaking with what he called a sickness of his bones. He had asked to dictate a confession on the condition that it not be read to anyone until after his death. The Reverend Jerish, perceiving that the man had very little time remaining, agreed. Herrick confessed that he had not in fact remained in the jailer's room that night. He had gone down the cellar stairs sometime after midnight, drawn first by the sound of weeping and then by the sound of laughter, moving against the specific instructions of George Corwin and against whatever remained of his own judgment. He had gone in his stocking feet without his boots so as to make no sound on the wooden steps. He had carried no light. He had held his father's Bible in his right hand as a talisman. The oak door of the cell had been unbolted when he reached the bottom of the stairs. It stood slightly ajar. A faint light, the color of candlelight but steadier than any candle he had ever seen, came from within. The ankle chains of all 9 women had been unlocked and coiled neatly on the stone floor, and inside the cell stood 3 men he recognized. One was Thomas Putnam. He stood near the door holding a small barn lantern, and he was looking at the 9 women with what Herrick described as the expression of a man counting his livestock before a sale. He nodded once to someone outside Herrick's line of sight. One was a village constable and man of high office in Essex County, whose name Herrick declined to include in the affidavit, identifying him only by the sound of his voice, which Herrick recognized from having heard it pronounce sentence in the courthouse not many days before. The man stood slightly behind Putnam with his hands clasped before him. He had not, Herrick noted, taken the trouble to change out of the coat he had worn on the bench, and one was a man Herrick had never in his life seen before. A man in a dark travel cloak, whose face Herrick could not bring himself to describe even now, on his deathbed, under the full weight of his approaching judgment, except to say that the man was carrying a leather satchel roughly the size of a small traveling bag, and that the leather satchel was moving. It moved, Herrick said, in a slow and regular rhythm, as if something inside it were breathing. But the rhythm was not quite the rhythm of any breath he had ever known. It had pauses where no lung would pause. It had quickenings where no lung would quicken. The man in the cloak held the satchel at his side as though he had been carrying it for a very long time, and had grown accustomed to its movement. The 9 women sat in a row on the stone floor, not speaking, not weeping, not moving. Their wrists had been bound one to the next with lengths of what appeared to be ordinary rope, but which made no sound when the man in the cloak gestured for them to rise. Their feet were bare, their eyes were open, and every one of them, Herrick wrote, was looking directly at him. Not one of them, all 9 of them, at the same moment, as though they had known, before he himself had known, that he was standing at the foot of the stairs. He fled back up the steps without a sound, his heart loud enough in his own ears that he was certain it would give him away. He lay down on the floor of the jailer's room, beside the snoring Corwin and the weeping Putnam the younger, and pretended to be asleep. And he heard, some unmeasurable time later, the sound of the oak door closing and the bolt sliding into place from the outside, the sound of footsteps on the cellar stairs, the sound of the outer jail door opening, and the sound of a cart moving slowly away on the muddy track beyond the building. And then nothing. He had not slept again that night. He had lain on the floor with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. And he had made himself a promise that he would never speak of what he had seen. And he had kept that promise for 25 years. And it had cost him, he said, his health, his peace, and the warmth of his marriage, his wife having known from the first week of July 1692 that something had happened inside that jail which her husband could not tell her, and having withdrawn from him by small degrees over a quarter-century into a silence of her own. The affidavit that Rogers found in 1843 did not remain in his possession long. Within 6 months of the discovery, he had written to 3 scholars of New England history, enclosing careful transcriptions of Herrick's words. Within a year of sending those letters, all 4 men, Rogers and his 3 correspondents, were dead. Rogers himself drowned in the Charles River on a November evening in 1844 in what was officially ruled a suicide, though there were no witnesses, and the body when recovered bore bruises on wrists and on the back of the neck which the coroner attributed to the current of the river. One of the scholars, George Braft, died of a fever contracted on a voyage to investigate parish records in Andover, a voyage undertaken specifically in response to Rogers's letter. Another, a clergyman named Peter Thatcher, was found at the base of his own church bell tower in Boston on a Sunday morning, the church having been locked since the previous evening and the door to the bell tower staircase still bolted from the inside. The third, a lawyer named Ephraim Peabody, died of what his attending physician recorded using the exact phrase that had been applied to Peter Cloy in 1699 and to Ebenezer Boddick some years after, a softening of the brain. In his final weeks, Peabody had become unable to speak. His wife reported that he would sit beside the fire in the evenings and stare into the flames and sometimes begin to weep. When she asked him what troubled him, he would raise his hand and show her the underside of his wrist, where a small mark had appeared some months earlier, a mark resembling nothing so much as the impression of a cross. She had initially taken it for a bruise. It had not faded with the weeks. It had not faded with the months. And it seemed on certain evenings to grow darker, without any pattern she could discern. The original notebook of Samuel Sewall was returned to the Sewall family papers and deposited in 1879 with the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it remains today and where any scholar may request to examine it. The affidavit of Joseph Herrick, the most damning document the notebook contained, was not deposited with it. Its current location is unknown. The two surviving transcriptions, made by Rogers before he sent his letters, are held in private collections and have been examined by a small number of researchers, each of whom has, for reasons not always documented, chosen not to publish their findings. What does survive in the Essex County Archive is the sealed box I mentioned at the beginning of this story. Labeled with the date June 29, 1692, and the single word incident. The box was opened once, in 1922, by a young archivist named Edith Pierce, who was working to catalogue the county's 17th century holdings under a grant from a private Boston foundation. Pierce's catalogue entry for the box is the only surviving professional description of its contents, 9 parchment sheets, each bearing a single cross in the lower right corner, otherwise blank. The crosses were identical in form to the marks made by the accused on the Salem complaint documents preserved elsewhere in the archive. One iron ankle ring, its lock mechanism partially melted as if exposed to tremendous heat, the metal itself showing the crystalline structure that forms when iron is heated to just below its melting point and then cooled rapidly, a phenomenon Pierce noted she could not account for, since the cellar of the Salem jail had contained no heat source sufficient to produce such an effect. One small pile of human hair, dark and shoulder length, braided into 9 small plates and bound at the crown of each plate with a thin strip of the same hair, intricately folded back upon itself. The hair showed no sign of the decay one would expect after more than 2 centuries. A county physician who examined it at Pierce's request noted that it had the appearance of hair cut from a living head rather than taken from a corpse, a distinction, he explained in a private letter, that was not easy to articulate precisely, but which any experienced embalmer would immediately recognize. One small leather pouch containing 9 wooden spoons, each carved from the same piece of wood, each marked on the handle with letter of the alphabet. The letters did not spell a word in English. They did, however, spell something that a colleague of Pierce's in the Harvard Divinity School, a scholar of medieval liturgy, identified in a letter dated September of 1922 as an acronym in Latin for a phrase used in a specific rite of the medieval Roman Church for the anointing of the dying. The phrase, translated into English, was, "Let them go in peace." 3 weeks after that letter was received, Edith Pierce resigned from the Essex County Archive, packed her personal belongings into 2 trunks, and returned to her family home in rural Vermont, where she lived for another 41 years. According to her nephew, who inherited her papers after her death in 1963, she never again spoke of her work in Massachusetts and would leave the room if the word Salem was spoken in her presence. The nephew, interviewed once in 1984 for a local historical society newsletter, said only that his aunt had kept, until the day she died, a small wooden box on the mantel above her fireplace. He had been told as a child never to open it. When he inherited the contents of her house, he honored her wishes and placed the box, unopened, into her coffin before burial. Just when we thought we'd seen everything, the horror in Salem goes deeper still. If this story has raised the hair on the back of your neck, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support what we do here. And subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Because there is one more document, and it may be the most disturbing of all. Its discovery is recent enough that some of the people connected to it are still living. And some of them are still afraid. In the spring of 2007, a family in East Hartford, Connecticut was clearing out the attic of a house that had belonged to their family for 9 generations. The house had been purchased, according to East Hartford town records, in the autumn of 1693, by a couple who had arrived from Massachusetts with no traceable history and considerable silver. They had given their names as Thomas and Mary Barker, and told neighbors they had married in Boston and wished to begin fresh in Connecticut following a loss in the family they preferred not to discuss. They paid £215 in silver for the house and the 50 acres surrounding it. They had lived quietly for the rest of their lives. They had 4 children. They were known in the community as gentle, reserved, modestly devout, never entirely at ease in the meeting house but never absent from it, generous to their neighbors in small ways and private in large ones. And Mary Barker had, according to her will drawn up in 1729 and preserved in the Hartford probate records, left to her eldest daughter a cedar chest that was not to be opened in the daughter's lifetime nor in the lifetime of anyone who had known the testator, but which was to be preserved within the family for as long as the family should endure, as a remembrance of a time of great trouble from which she had been delivered by the mercy of God and by the kindness of a friend whose name she could not commit to writing. The cedar chest had passed through 9 generations. It had been opened periodically over the centuries, and by 2007 it contained, in addition to whatever had been placed in it originally, a Civil War pension certificate, a bundle of love letters from the 1920s, a christening gown from the 1950s, and a folded wedding dress from the 1980s. Beneath all of these, resting at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a linen shift of extraordinary age, was a small bound volume approximately the size of a modern paperback. Its cover appeared to be aged brown leather, but was determined by a conservator at the Bainach Library at Yale University, to whom the family brought it for authentication, to be something other than leather. The conservator's private report concluded only that the material was organic in origin, was not the skin of any commonly available animal, and showed structural characteristics consistent with human dermis tanned using methods known to have been practiced in New England in the late 17th century. The pages of the volume were filled with small, careful handwriting in a form of English that a Yale linguist dated to the last decade of the 17th century, consistent with the education and likely age of a literate woman born in the 1630s. The volume was a diary. It had been kept, according to its opening page, by a woman whose name was written there in full, in her own hand. Her name was Mary Osgood. She had begun the diary on the 1st of July, 1692, 2 days after she had vanished from the Salem jail. 3 days after she had been scheduled to hang, the diary was not long. It covered approximately 11 months, ending in May of 1693. It described, in careful and sometimes beautiful prose, the life of a woman beginning again in a new place under a new name, with a husband she had met by arrangement some 6 weeks after her arrival in Connecticut, a widower named Thomas Barker, whose first wife had died in childbed and who had been told only that his new wife was a respectable Massachusetts woman who had suffered a terrible loss. With a community that asked her no questions, because the man in the dark travel cloak had, she wrote, sent word ahead, and the community had been made to understand that certain newcomers would arrive that autumn whose pasts were not to be inquired after. The diary described her daily work, the long Connecticut winter of 1692, the slow return of something resembling peace. She wrote of learning to love her new husband, a man who never once asked her about the name she no longer used, and who accepted with a quiet patience more moving to her than any declaration could have been the fact that his wife sometimes woke in the night weeping and could not explain why. She wrote of cooking, of spinning, of the small church at the end of the lane, of the neighbor woman who arrived in the first week of September with a basket of apples and asked her nothing beyond whether she preferred to bake them or eat them fresh. She described the other 8 women, settled in towns and villages within a day's ride of one another across the Connecticut River Valley, whom she saw in various small gatherings over the course of that year. They met in one another's kitchens under the pretext of ordinary visits and spoke of ordinary things. They never spoke of the cellar, of the oak door, of the sound of the cart on the track, of the 9 chains that had been unlocked without a key. Once, in February of 1693, Mary wrote that she and a woman she called only Sarah, who can only be Sarah Cloyce, had sat together beside a fire in a farmhouse near Wethersfield, and had wept without speaking for a full hour. Then they had dried their tears, spoken only of the quality of that year's butter, and gone on with the visit. They had not looked at each other while they wept, they had not embraced. They had sat on either side of the hearth, and stared into the fire, and allowed themselves, for that 1 hour, to grieve for what they could not name. And then they had stopped, as if by prior arrangement, and had gone on. And once, in a single entry dated the 10th of November, 1692, the diary described the man in the dark travel cloak, and the terms he had offered them in the cell. He had come to them, Mary wrote, through the unlocked door on the night of the 28th, accompanied by Thomas Putnam and by a man she called only the High Gentleman, whose identity she said she had been warned never to attempt to learn, because to know it would be to be unable to forget it. And forgetting, she wrote, was the first duty asked of her. The man in the cloak had explained the terms of their release with great gentleness. He had spoken in a voice Mary described as the voice of a very old man, though his movements had not been old. He had addressed each of them in turn by the name she had been given in baptism, not the name by which she had been accused. He had offered each of them individually a choice, to remain in the cell and hang at dawn, or to go with him and never speak under any circumstance, for as long as she lived, of what had occurred in that cell, of who she had once been, of the village she was leaving, of her husband, of her children, of any person who had ever known her by her true name. He told them their silence was required not solely for the protection of the men who had arranged their release, though that was one consequence of it. Their silence was required, he said, because the true purpose of the Salem proceedings was not the execution of witches. The executions were the public face of the enterprise, the face that would be remembered, the face that would be written into the histories, into the pamphlets, into the sermons of repentance. The true purpose was the transfer of approximately 4,000 acres of disputed farmland from families who had held it for 2 or 3 generations to families who would put it to a different use, a use he did not fully specify, but which required the land to be understood in the public mind as spoiled, cursed, ground upon which no prudent man would wish to build. The hangings served this purpose by attaching to the accused families a permanent stigma. No one would contest title to land whose previous owner had hanged for witchcraft. No descendant would step forward to claim an inheritance tainted by that shame. The ground would be quietly and permanently available. The disappearances served a different purpose. They made it possible to remove from the contested land certain families whose members were too well connected, too respected, too sympathetically regarded by their neighbors to be hanged without endangering the wider enterprise. For those families, he said, a body on the gallows would have produced a martyr, and a martyr would have produced inquiries, and inquiries would have produced truth. What was wanted for those families was not death. It was absence, not a corpse on the gallows, but a cell found empty one morning. The hangings were a theatrical necessity. The disappearances were a practical mercy, and the disappearances would continue for as long as was required, and the land would change hands for as long as was required. And the true history of what was being conducted in New England in those years would not be committed to paper, because the men who would write it were the men arranging it, and because the women who had been its hidden victims would be, by his arrangement, alive and grateful and silent. Each of them, he said, would receive a new name, a new husband, a new home in a town chosen for its distance from any road a traveler from Essex County might take, a sum of money sufficient to establish her new household, and the guarantee of her life and the lives of every child she might yet have. In exchange, she would give him her silence and the silence of every descendant after her, for as long as her blood continued. If she spoke, he said, if at any point in her life she spoke of the cell, or of the cloak, or of the bargain would be broken and a price would be collected. He did not say what the price would be. He did not need to. Each of the women had in that moment a clear and precise understanding of what could be taken from her. It is the particular cruelty of such arrangements, Mary Osgood wrote, that they do not require the threat to be spoken. The threat is assembled by the mind of the person who bears it, shaped in each case exactly to the deepest fear that person carries. And there is no negotiating with the threat one has constructed oneself. Mary Osgood closed that diary entry with a single sentence. The only sentence in the entire volume in which she permitted herself to sound afraid. "I do not know," she wrote, "what became of the ninth woman among us. She did not come with us to Connecticut. She did not come with us at all. And when I asked the man in the cloak where she had gone, he did not answer me. But I saw his satchel move." The remainder of the diary from the 11th of November 1692 until the final entry in May of 1693 contains no further reference to the cloak, the cell, the 9 women, or the ninth. It contains only the quiet chronicle of a woman making a life out of silence. The final entry reads in its entirety, "I have planted the garden today. Thomas has built a new gate. The apple trees are in flower. I believe I am with child. May God forgive us all." The Osgood Diary is currently held in the private collection of the family that found it. They have declined since the initial authentication in 2007 to make it available to scholars, citing the wishes of an elderly family member who was in her 90s at the time of the discovery and has since passed away. The family has declined since her passing to revisit that decision. A partial transcription made by the Yale conservator during the brief period of authentication exists in limited academic circulation and has been the subject of 2 doctoral dissertations, both of which were quietly withdrawn before publication, one by a student at Boston University and one at a seminary in Philadelphia. Both students are still living. Both have moved into fields entirely unrelated to their original subjects. Neither returns calls on the subject of Salem, the Osgood Diary, or what the man in the cloak may have meant when he said the land would be put to a different use. The Essex County Archive still holds the sealed box. The box is still labeled Incident, and its contents, according to a telephone call made in the course of preparing this story to the present day archivist, are still exactly as Edith Pierce described them in 1922, down to the 9 parchment sheets and the iron ankle ring with its partially melted lock, and the 9 small plates of hair, which, according to a recent privately funded examination, still show no sign of decay. More than 330 years after they were cut, the 9 parcels of land along the Salem village and Andover border changed hands many times over the centuries that followed. They are today, in whole or in part, the sites of a regional shopping mall, a private school, 2 cemeteries of which one is closed to new interments, a stretch of state highway, and a small industrial park that has had 3 separate owners over the years, each of whom has sold the property within 5 years of acquiring it. None of these places is regarded in local tradition as haunted. None has ever been the subject of any unusual report. No ghost story attaches to any of the 9 parcels. No historical marker indicates what happened on any of them. The land, as the man in the cloak is said to have promised, has done what was required of it, and the forgetting has been perhaps the most thorough thing about the entire affair. What this story shows us, perhaps, is that the most terrifying thing about Salem was not what we were told. It was not the hysteria of the accusers, or the cruelty of the judges, or the fear of a colonial village pressed against the dark forest at its edge. The most terrifying thing about Salem was that beneath all of that, beneath the visible horror, there was a second horror. Quieter, more patient, more interested in property than in souls. A horror that has never been prosecuted, never been named, never been fully acknowledged, and never, so far as we can tell, gone away. Every generation since the Osgoods were loaded onto that cart in the grey dawn of June 29th, 1692, has produced its own men in dark travel cloaks. its own quiet transfers of land. Its own families taught, as Mary Osgood's descendants were taught, that there are certain questions one does not ask, certain names one does not speak, and certain cedar chests one does not open. Not in your lifetime, not in the lifetime of anyone who might remember, and perhaps somewhere there is still a ninth woman, or the memory of one, in a satchel that continues to move. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Do you think the ninth woman ever truly left that cellar? Leave your comment below. If dark mysteries like this are what you live for, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and send this to someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next one.